just trying to get in the habit of prompting well. It may be more of a learning curve, but I think it's going to get people the results they want faster. So this is also the double, both sides win part of the scenario, and you'll get a better response.
Hello, and welcome to Environment Variables, brought to you by the Green Software Foundation. In each episode, we discuss the latest news and events surrounding green software. On our show, you can expect candid conversations with top experts in their field who have a passion for how to reduce the greenhouse gas emissions of software. I'm your host, Chris Adams.
Welcome back to the Week in Green Software. Today, we're talking about a shift that's happening in real time. AI is turning compute into a budget line everyone can feel. And sustainability is moving from nice to have to something that looks a lot more like audit requirements. I'm Tzviya Siegman, and I've been off for a few weeks. I'm excited to catch up with my fellow host, Kate Goldenring. Kate, how have you been?
Hi, Tzviya. It's nice to talk to you and be back again. I've been doing okay. I sprained my ankle recently right before a race I was supposed to do with my partner. So instead, I ended up being the person cheering on from the sidelines. And I did get myself into a bit of a mess when I accidentally started crutching across the start line of a 5K right as the gun went off. So I was almost stampeded by 3,000 runners who were starting 10 meters from me. I did make it across, but it was definitely a doozy and not my best feat.
Oh, wow. I hope your ankle's doing better, and I hope that you're up to running again soon. I know that you really enjoy running.
Yeah.
Stay on the sidelines. For this show, we picked 3 stories that connect the dots between AI efficiency, carbon, and water impacts, and the growing push for better disclosure, from cloud dashboards to EU reporting rules. Let's get into it. There's this great article from Better Tech about 7 ways for more frugal AI. It provides practical tactics with measured savings. It's a really interesting article. I personally love this article. Whenever I speak about sustainability in tech, people always want to know, what can I do today? This is a really practical checklist for teams trying to reduce AI energy and costs without waiting for some enormous miracle breakthrough. It covers choices like right-sizing, caching, retrieval, tightening prompts, and avoiding always-on agent behavior. The useful angle here is that it treats frugality as an engineering discipline. You can measure, iterate, and document savings like any other optimization. So what's one frugal AI practice that you think teams can adopt this week that won't trigger like a big internal fight?
Yeah, I think, I first of all want to agree that I love this article. I tend to jot down all of the links that I see and all the resources and keep a running page. And from this, I think I grabbed 10 and put in my vault of helpful links. And it mentioned some things that we talked about, like electricity maps with Ryan. And so it really is a wealth. So I recommend people read it, but we'll try and give you some of the insights from it. And like you mentioned, it does focus on frugal AI. So the idea that if I am diligent about how I use AI, I can not only save money, but also help meet sustainability targets. And one of the ones that stood out to me was the very first one, which is, do I need AI? And I think that's a question we need to constantly be asking ourselves, because if you're a big technology enthusiast, you might be excited to constantly apply AI to every problem, or your investors may want the where's AI in this angle. And I think he does a good job of pointing out how you can save money by, being more scrupulous with this. So, and I've encountered this with things at my work where we're trying to understand where an agent is useful and where one isn't. And we were releasing a version of a plugin, and it felt like a task that was very well defined. And sometimes your mind immediately goes to, okay, then I'll have an agent run through this release document. So run through a markdown document, when in reality, the better solution there is run through this markdown document and create a script. So now I only have to execute a script every few weeks when we release this, instead of every few weeks having an agent reread a document and go through all these steps and continue to use more and more tokens each time. So it's really figuring out, what can I turn into something that can be used as a tool versus using an agent over and over again was one example that I've seen in my workplace.
I completely agree with that. I feel like the term AI has become so sexy that people are using it when they often mean automation. At my former employer, one of my jobs was actually reviewing the proposals for AI projects. This was like way at the beginning of what we're now calling the AI boom. And a lot of times when people were saying that they wanted to use generative AI, what they actually meant was, I want to automate this project. And it was really funny to hear people saying this, because I think in a way a lot of people who aren't familiar with automation are now becoming familiar with automation, and they just don't have the terms for it. So I think one thing that's important, especially with people who aren't as tech savvy, is to really define the terms automation, AI, machine learning even, and generative AI, so that people can really become familiar with this. And like you said, Kate, let's help people become familiar with these and not make things more expensive. And I mean that in terms of cost, but also from a sustainability perspective and from a human perspective. We don't need to make things more complicated than necessary.
Yeah, and I think your point about education and learning is a valuable one here. I think we're all jumping into using this new tool without thinking about how to go about it necessarily. And in the article, it also talks about how to effectively prompt engineer, and how I've even noticed this in my own experience. Like, he mentions using the CoStar method from the start, which, if you're not familiar, the CoStar method is a method of how you write a prompt. So you first give context, so background on the task that needs to be done. You give a clear objective. You from the start say what style you want the output to be in, so what writing style. And then you also are explicit about the tone. So what is the attitude of the response? And the audience is the A there. So who is this response for? And then the actual response. So say, what output do you want? Is this markdown? Is this blah, blah, text? Is this JSON, etc.? And I think sometimes we're so eager to get a result that we don't go through all of CoStar, and instead it becomes okay, rewrite this in this tone, or can you summarize this to be shorter? And I think just trying to get in the habit of prompting well, it may be more of a learning curve, but I think it's going to get people the results they want faster. So this is also the double, both sides win part of the scenario, and you'll get a better response, period, and it'll be less tokens.
I feel like that's also really good advice for speaking to humans. Tell people what. Another really good piece of advice, and we've talked about this a lot on TWiGS, with small language models. There are a lot of great references in this article about how to get started. There's ml.energy/leaderboard, and a lot of this article is about how to effectively go small, because sometimes when you hear that, it's just unclear about how to get started. So it's really worth the read in this article, and about what direction to go in. There's discussion about what is hosting, how to evaluate on an ongoing basis. And often we hear a lot about how open source really matters for sustainability purposes, but this article really explains why, or at least one of the aspects of why, and how with monitoring, open source is really the only way to go if you expect to be able to continue monitoring your AI. So I think you hear from both of us that this is a really important article to read, and it can really help you make an impact today. Any other thoughts on that, Kate?
I would just say I feel like I could keep going on a lot of it, but one, to piggyback on the right model for the right solution. We talked about the different flops for different folks paper from Hugging Face in a previous episode. So if you're interested in knowing more about that, that episode would be good to check out. And we talk about how within fields, there's different models. So in scientific research, there might be a model that's better for them. But as a general user, someone who maybe you're familiar with going to ChatGPT for any question, maybe you can be more discerning as well using some of the resources mentioned in this article.
Great, thank you. So now we're going to pivot focus a little bit into the world of water. We've spoken a bit about water in the past, talking about the Great Lakes and what people in that region are looking for. We're going to take a little bit of a dive into the academic world. There's been a study about where data centers run and how that determines water stress. The study argues that the location of a data center can matter nearly 5,000 times more than water sustainability than the cooling method used. That pushes us past the usual debate of which cooling tech is greener and toward a harder question. Should some workloads, in particular AI, be placed differently based on local water stress? For software teams, it also broadens the question to some extent about what carbon aware should mean, because water risk may be the limiting factor in some regions. So, taking a step back, the reason water is an issue, which I know I've been asked by some people that I discuss this with, is that water for data centers comes from river catchments, reservoirs, or aquifers through the municipal supply system. And sometimes it's supplemented with reclaimed water, brackish groundwater, or seawater, if that's available. And a significant amount of that water evaporates. So every liter of water used for AI cooling or electricity has to do with the water balance of a particular river and aquifer system, rather than that like abstract global pool of fresh water. So it's not just that we like fill a glass of water and it evaporates and it comes back as rainwater. This paper proposes translating liters into location-specific stress, water stress that is, and capacity thresholds. And it proposes a framework to inform cooling design and workload scheduling so that AI's growth is within sustainable hydrological limits. So that is a pretty complicated way of saying there's proposals to shift data centers to locations where water limits will not be reached, even looking at a few years and looking at what we think climate change is going to adjust. So let's think about, should water-aware scheduling become a real requirement for cloud and AI workloads, and what would need to happen to make this feasible? I know you have thoughts on this, Kate.
I think one big part about this article was that there's not a lot of data out there, which is any article that we read in this space is we had to make these assumptions because. So the one thing I get excited about with water-aware scheduling is it assumes we have data. So if we had data on, the amount, the index they create in this paper is the hydrological stress index. So if I knew the hydrological stress index of every data center and could choose to not put any workloads in Phoenix, which was the most stressed geographic area they found hydrologically, then I would love that. And I think we're getting there with this paper. I think one of the things they had to do is they had to hold technology constant in this paper. And they said that was because even if they did take into account, for example, advances in cooling to be more efficient for data centers, it would still not even compare to the hydrological differences by an order of magnitude. So I think this paper also points out that you'll hear a lot of talk about improved cooling techniques. And some of that is moot because of because it does not compare to the water bed and water availability. So even if you make some percentage change in the amount of water you need, we're not talking enough in terms of how big that percentage is to the local stress. And I think that's something that this paper really drills into.
Yeah, thank you. I think my biggest takeaway from this paper is that no matter how much advocacy we have for water awareness and changing the way that we use data centers, like you said, water disclosure is crucial. And it seemed to me that the biggest recommendation is moving data centers away to moving data centers to areas that can support them in water-rich areas. What this doesn't look at is things like electricity and where the electricity comes from. We've had this conversation in the past about how we can talk about how Phoenix, for example, is an area where there's not a lot of water, but there's a lot of solar power. So this looks at just one piece of the puzzle. And water is obviously a very important piece of the puzzle. But the idea of water overscheduling is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I think if they combine this study with a study that probably exists with liters of water per kilowatt hour of type of energy, so like solar uses this many liters of water per kilowatt hour produced, and then we use something like, say, electricity maps or something to get a sense of what the prevailing energy source is for that region, and then combined it with this understanding of where water is coming from and the hydrological, we could maybe get a more accurate hydrological stress index and build off of this even further.
Yeah, I would love to see electricity maps or some other organization add on to their work and build water maps. That would be really exciting. So, anybody who's looking to disruption is ready to have it.
Yeah. And I will say this paper also mentions, I mean, we talk a lot about in naming, I named Phoenix, but even across the world, they're starting to expand data centers in areas that are water stressed. And so this is very much a global problem as data centers are being built out in completely new regions that maybe cannot support, their water beds can't support that expansion.
Yeah, and the regions this paper focus on are primarily in the United States, but absolutely this is a worldwide problem. And the paper mentioned specifically that this is specifically a problem in the global South, where the reporting and disclosure requirements are truly non-existent.
Yeah, and I think that was a huge part that we were kind of focusing on today is disclosure requirements not being where they need to be. Water is a commons, clearly, and it's quite surprising to me that we don't require that at all. And that's an area that I would love to dig into more of, like, who is doing that disclosure right.
Yeah. Even in the areas where scope 1, 2, 3 emissions are required, I don't know very much about water disclosure requirements. And certainly, if you look at like the UN Sustainable Development Goals, water is perhaps more prominent than carbon. Water is undeniably necessary for human life, right? We look at Mars. Mars has water. That's what we say is a sign of potential life. Water is the thing that makes life possible. And we see so little about water disclosure requirements. So I would love to learn more about that, and maybe we can talk to some of the people who are involved in disclosure legislation and policy about where that's headed. Which is a good segue into the next article, which is an article in The Guardian, which is kind of the opposite. Apparently, U.S. tech firms have lobbied the EU to keep data center emissions secret. This is about transparency versus confidentiality. This piece highlights the tension between public interest and corporate confidentiality in data center reporting, suggesting industry pressure shapes EU rules to keep certain emissions data non-public. Regardless of where you land politically, the practical implication is pretty clear. If reporting is only partial or it's opaque, it's harder for customers, investors, and regulators to compare providers or verify claims. And it puts more pressure on voluntary dashboards and third-party measurements to fill the gaps with mixed results. As we were just discussing with the water conversation, and even with the conversation about how to make a difference with AI today, it's really hard to know what you're doing if you can't measure it. So I think a conversation that we could have today is what level of emissions disclosure should be considered table stakes for cloud providers. Should it be customer only, regulator only? Should it be totally public? What do you think, Kate?
I mean, I think the standards we've had of greenhouse gas emissions tracking, scope 1, 2, and 3, and water depletion, how much are you taking in versus putting back out are just table stakes for this, for sure. And I 100% think it should be public. I understand why people may say like they'll only give it to regulators or customers, but and maybe the concern is that you're putting money into innovating your data centers and you want to keep that competitive advantage. But I don't think that's a space where competitive advantage should be prized. I think that is something that is a scientific wealth to be shared when it comes to data center efficiency. So, and policy can help require that knowledge sharing there. So I'm very much for the public availability of that information and the requirement of at least that amount of information. I think it's interesting because last episode, Chris Adams and I talked about the CSRD, which is a directive that is in Europe. And starting next year, people are going to have to start reporting their basically how they're doing on the overall emissions of their organization, and it includes a lot of things. And we talked in particular about how it includes software in that episode, but it certainly includes data center energy use. And so they're going to have to be doing estimates if they can't get this data from data centers. And that's just all of them are probably going to take the same estimated numbers, and we're not going to be able to track progress.
Yeah, and the same is true for the California SB 261 disclosure requirements. I completely agree with you, Kate, on what I think should be table stakes. As we learned from all the discussions we've had today, metrics can evolve. I would love to see some of the giant corporations that we're talking about get behind improving metrics. The talk about competitive advantage, I think, completely falls apart. You know, I come from the world of standards. This is where standards are important. If you are comparing, if company one is saying my emissions are measured with a yardstick, and company two is saying my emissions are measured with volumetrically, and I'm obviously using just simple concepts to measure this, then how can we possibly compare them? And so if they truly want to have the competitive advantage, we need to be measuring with the same tools. So coming to terms around what the standards are, and we don't have to standardize this in an organization like the W3C. It can be standardized anywhere. I don't really care where. It needs to. We need to agree to what the standards are for metrics, for emissions, for water, for all of these, and then there needs to be an agreement, consensus, around how we measure things. And then I think it should be public. If organizations can't agree to make this public, it at least needs to be at a regulatory level, because like you just said, if we have to report these, if my organization has to report this for CSRD, for the US laws, and many other countries around the world are requiring this, how can I possibly report it if I don't know what I'm reporting? So this goes to, it's all circular. I can't think of a way that this can work if I don't know what I'm measuring. And we don't agree on what we're measuring. And, we can create tools only if we have a yardstick.
Yeah. I'll say also this article left a lot to be curious about. It, in general, just mentions that the lobbying would lead to classifying more information on data centers as confidential, but I don't know what that information exactly is. Like, I don't know exactly how much would be excluded in this case, and that's something I would love to understand more about. And what is the scope of all that can be kept confidential, and how much can that word be fudged?
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot to question there. And, in a world where we're talking not just about, an organization's finances, for example, which generally finances are public when we're dealing with a public organization, we're talking about the way that this affects our lives. Sustainability is something that affects people on a day-to-day basis. And I think that's why the larger, not just the large organizations, these organizations are perhaps scared to reveal the information. And a lot of people have talked about when will AI face its big tobacco moment. It's starting to happen slowly. The comparison, I think, is apt, right? Tobacco was treated as something beneficial to consumers for a long time. And then we started to learn about the health risks, and lawsuits started happening. And there are a lot of health risks, we'll call it, to AI, whether it's about the way that people interact with it or it's about the way that it pollutes the environment. We are starting to see these lawsuits come out. I think I saw something today about, I forgot which body was suing, I think it was OpenAI, about a person's interaction that led to suicide. So we're seeing the mental health lawsuits now. It's only a matter of time before we see the lawsuits about the environment.
Yeah, and I feel like those are going to come less from the emissions of the energy used by data centers and more, honestly, by the water depletion, because that's going to have a more local effect on those communities. And that's the clear cause and effect of a local community there will probably be where we'll start to see a bit of a rallying around trying to get more transparency, especially by like local officials and representatives. Probably will be pushed by their constituents to try and get some more transparency there.
Yeah, I agree with that. I can't remember where I saw an article earlier this week, but it was something along the lines of, if the NIMBY crowd, the Not in My Backyard crowd, works with developers, then we'll have a real rallying cry and we'll probably be able to make some progress.
Wow, that's one way to get some power out of some NIMBYs. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I think we could really see it happening. It's already started to happen in areas like the data center alley area in Virginia. I've talked before about the articles we've seen about people, suing or showing up at least to town hall meetings where Amazon and the likes want to build their data centers, and people not being willing to give up their land for it. So I think Ryan probably spoke about that when he was on the show. It's a favorite topic of his. Maybe I can have him back.
Yeah, and then we get into the conversations of environmental justice and who has the voice to say, not in my backyard. Obviously, we've had issues like this with fracking and other regional extraction. So, there's a lot of intersections of topics here that we can touch on.
Sure. Let's talk about events coming up. Here are a few to have on your radar. First up, Measuring Software at Scale on May 5th at 6:30 CEST in Karlsruhe. How do I pronounce that? It's a hybrid event. Carmen's project lead walks through how the tool brings software carbon intensity measurement into wider application, and there's a link in the show notes. If you'd like to speak at Green I/O conferences in 2026, the call for speakers is open if you're working on green software, sustainable AI, or real-world measurement stories. Kate and I will both be at Green I/O New York. We would love to meet you there. Finally, submit a paper to the Hot Carbon Workshop if you've got research on carbon-aware computing, measurement, or systems that reduce emissions in practice. That's it for this week. We covered how AI efficiency is becoming a first-class engineering target, why water constraints are an under-discussed part of data center sustainability, and how transparency rules, or lack of them, shape what teams can credibly measure and improve. Thanks for listening to This Week in Green Software. Thanks, Kate, for joining me. A final reminder that all resources for this episode are in the show description below, and you can visit podcast.greensoftware.foundation to listen to more episodes of Environment Variables. See you in the next episode. Bye for now.
Hey everyone, thanks for listening. Just a reminder to follow Environment Variables on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. And please do leave a rating and review if you like what we're doing. It helps other people discover the show, and of course, we'd love to have more listeners. To find out more about the Green Software Foundation, please visit greensoftware.foundation. That's greensoftware.foundation in any browser. Thanks again, and see you in the next episode.